Richard Lawson, the CEO of one of the largest banking chains in the country, had built his career on resilience and strategic thinking. His journey from a modest upbringing to leading a billion-dollar financial institution was marked by discipline, unwavering focus, and an unshakable belief in fairness. His bank was built on principles of equal access, trust, and service excellence. He had spent years shaping policies that emphasized customer-first service, ensuring that every individual, regardless of background, was treated with respect. Yet, despite his best efforts, troubling reports had reached his desk. Customers, particularly Black customers, spoke of being scrutinized, delayed, or outright denied basic banking services. Some described being asked unnecessary questions when trying to withdraw their own money. Others mentioned the unease of being followed by security as soon as they stepped inside. These weren't isolated incidents. The more he listened, the more he realized a deeper issue was at play, one that policies alone couldn't fix. Richard had long believed that leadership wasn't just about making decisions from behind a desk. It required stepping into the shoes of those affected, seeing the flaws firsthand, and making changes from within. He needed to know, without filters, whether his bank was truly living up to its promise. There was only one way to find out. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard sat in his office reviewing the details of his plan. He wouldn't enter as the CEO. There would be no assistance, no formal introductions, no red carpet treatment. He would walk into one of his own branches as an ordinary customer, someone who didn't command instant recognition or special privileges. He wanted to experience, with no warning to the staff, what any other Black man in his position might face. The following morning, Richard deliberately dressed in a way that would make him unassuming. His usual crisp suit and polished shoes stayed in the closet. Instead, he put on a plain hoodie, a pair of jeans, and comfortable sneakers. His Rolex was swapped for a basic digital watch. He left his sleek company car behind, avoiding any indication of wealth or status. Instead, he took public transportation, blending into the morning rush. As he sat among the commuters, he reflected on what he was about to do. He had chosen a branch in an affluent neighborhood, one he rarely visited himself but knew was frequented by high-net-worth clients. This branch had received no direct complaints, but that didn't mean issues didn't exist. Bias often operated in subtle ways, invisible in reports but deeply felt by those who experienced it. He was about to test whether those whispers of discrimination were unfounded grievances or a reality hidden beneath polite smiles and company slogans. When he arrived at the bank, he took a moment to observe the flow of customers, the demeanor of the staff, the way interactions played out. He noted how some were greeted warmly while others barely received a glance. He wasn't here to jump to conclusions, but he had spent years studying behavior and body language. Patterns weren't hard to recognize. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. His role as CEO was set aside. For the next hour, he was just another customer, walking into his own institution to make a simple request. Richard stood at the counter, maintaining his composure. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, but now that it was unfolding, a different kind of reality was setting in. The way Nancy had barely acknowledged him, the hesitation in her tone. It all pointed to an attitude he had heard about but had never personally experienced within his own institution. He had designed policies to prevent exactly this kind of behavior, yet here he was on the receiving end of it. As Chris held his ID and bank card, there was a noticeable pause. The young banker studied the documents longer than necessary. Richard had been in banking long enough to know that verifying identity didn't require this much scrutiny. Still, he waited, giving them the benefit of the doubt. $10,000 is quite a bit of cash, Chris said, setting the ID down on the desk in front of him. Are you making a big purchase? Richard didn't react immediately. The question itself wasn't uncommon, but he knew when it was being asked out of routine and when it was being used as a barrier. His name was on the account. His identification matched. The bank had more than enough liquidity to handle a request of this size. There was no reason for a customer to justify withdrawing their own money. I just need the cash, Richard replied, keeping his voice calm. Is there a problem? Chris shifted in his chair. Well, we just have to take extra precautions with large transactions. Fraud is a big concern these days. Let me check something. Without waiting for a response, Chris walked away, ID and bank card still in hand. Richard watched as he approached another banker, a manager by the looks of it, and whispered something. The manager glanced in Richard's direction, then leaned in, engaging in what was clearly a quiet discussion. Richard had seen this play out before, not as a customer, but as an executive reviewing customer complaints. It was the delay tactic. First, they question the request. Then, they seek out a reason to deny or delay the transaction. Often, customers would get frustrated and leave, their time wasted, their dignity eroded. But Richard wasn't leaving. After a few minutes, Chris returned, his expression unreadable. "We're going to need to verify some additional detail," he said. "Do you have another form of ID?" Richard suppressed a sigh. His bank card and government-issued ID were more than sufficient. "This is my official ID," he said evenly. "It matches my account details." Chris nodded but didn't seem convinced. "I understand, sir. It's just bank policy. We need to be extra careful with transactions over a certain amount." Richard leaned forward slightly. "What's the threshold for requiring extra verification?" Chris hesitated. "It depends on the circumstances." "Then tell me the circumstances that apply here," Richard pressed. There was a pause. Chris glanced at Nancy, who quickly busied herself with paperwork. The energy at the counter had shifted. Other customers were moving in and out smoothly, greeted with standard levels of service. No one else seemed to be undergoing this level of scrutiny. Chris exhaled. "Give me a moment." He turned and walked back toward the manager, who now looked mildly uncomfortable. Richard could see them speaking again, this time with more urgency. Richard checked his watch. Nearly 15 minutes had passed since he first made his request. This was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a direct reflection of the complaints he had received. The very thing he had refused to believe was happening right in front of him, and they still had no idea who he was. Richard kept his voice steady, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Let me get this straight," he said. "I have an account in good standing. My ID matches my account details. My balance is more than enough to cover this transaction. And yet you can't process my withdrawal?" Chris exhaled slowly. "It's just policy, sir." Richard let the words sit between them for a moment. "Which policy exactly?" Chris hesitated. "Like I said, large withdrawals require additional verification. We have to be extra cautious." Richard's jaw tightened. "You mean to tell me that I need additional proof of income to access my own money? Since when is that a requirement for a withdrawal?" Chris shifted uncomfortably. "We just want to make sure everything is in order. If you can provide additional documentation—" "Documentation for what?" Richard interrupted. "You're implying that I need to prove I earned the money that's already sitting in my account?" Chris opened his mouth, then closed it again. His silence spoke volumes. Richard shook his head. "And how long does this so-called verification process take?" Chris glanced toward the manager again. "It could take a few days, maybe a week, depending on the circumstances." Richard's patience was nearing its limit. "So you expect me to wait a week to access money that belongs to me, while other customers, who don't look like me, are withdrawing even larger amounts without a problem?" Chris looked at the security guard, who had taken a step closer. Richard noticed how quickly the situation had escalated. He had made no threats, caused no disturbance, yet here he was, being treated as a potential problem rather than a valued customer. "You're making this more difficult than it has to be," Chris muttered. Richard let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Number you are, because I guarantee you, if I looked different, this conversation wouldn't be happening." Chris didn't respond. Richard took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had come here expecting some level of bias, but this was beyond what he had anticipated. This wasn't just hesitation. This was an active attempt to block him from his own funds. "Let me make something clear," Richard said, his voice firm. "I'm not leaving without my money." Chris tensed. "Sir, if you continue to escalate—" "Escalate," Richard cut in. "I asked for a standard withdrawal. You turned it into an interrogation. I pointed out the inconsistency in your process. You ignored it. And now, instead of addressing the issue, you're implying that I'm the problem." The security guard took another step forward. Richard caught the silent exchange between him and Chris. Chris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir, if you're not willing to cooperate, I'll have to involve upper management. But I'll be honest with you, I don't think this withdrawal is happening today. Richard clenched his jaw. He had heard enough. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. If that's the case, he said, then it's time I speak to someone with actual authority. Chris frowned. Sir, I am a representative of this bank. Not anymore, Richard said, because the next call I make will be to the real decision makers. Chris blinked. And who would that be? Richard stared at him for a beat. Then, in a calm, measured tone, he said, Me. Richard lowered his phone, his expression unreadable. So, Mr. Reynolds, explain to me why your staff has just denied a routine withdrawal from one of your most loyal customers. Reynolds swallowed hard. Mr. Lawson, I assure you, there's been some sort of miscommunication. Richard tilted his head slightly. A miscommunication? That's interesting, because from where I'm standing, it looks more like discrimination. Chris shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance toward Reynolds. Sir, we were just following protocol. Richard cut him off. Which protocol would that be? The one that applies only when a customer looks like me? Reynolds fumbled for words. That's not what there must have been a misunderstanding. Richard folded his arms. No misunderstanding, just a very clear, systemic issue, one that, as of this moment, I intend to address personally. Chris took a small step back. Sir, I didn't know that I was the CEO, Richard finished for him. And that's precisely why this conversation is so important, because I shouldn't have to be the CEO to be treated with basic respect. Nancy, who had been silently observing from behind the counter, suddenly found herself under Richard's direct gaze. Do you remember our interaction a few minutes ago? He asked her. Her voice was tight. Yes, sir. Do you treat all customers that way, or just the ones who don't fit your assumptions about who should be banking here? Nancy's mouth opened, then closed. Richard turned back to Reynolds. How many other customers have been put through this kind of experience in this branch? How many have been humiliated, delayed, and discouraged from accessing their own funds simply because they didn't fit the preferred profile? Reynolds ran a hand over his forehead. Mr. Lawson, I can assure you. Richard held up a hand again. Save it, because here's what's going to happen next. The bank was silent. Employees who had been assisting other customers were now frozen in place, listening intently. Even the security guard who had positioned himself earlier was suddenly unsure of his stance. Richard continued. First, I'm withdrawing my money right now. No delays, no excuses. Reynolds nodded so quickly it almost seemed reflexive. Of course, sir, right away. Second, Richard went on, this branch and every branch in this company is about to undergo a full-scale review of its customer service policies. That includes training, monitoring, and where necessary, staffing changes. Chris swallowed hard. And third, Richard added, his voice even, I will personally ensure that no customer, regardless of race, background, or appearance, ever has to experience what I did today. And if I find out that this kind of discrimination continues, heads will roll. Reynolds nodded vigorously. Absolutely, Mr. Lawson. We'll take immediate action. Richard let the weight of his words settle. Good. Now process my withdrawal. The transaction was completed in record time. No additional questions, no unnecessary delays, just efficiency, the way it should have been from the beginning. Richard took the envelope of cash and slipped it into his pocket. He met Chris's gaze one last time. Next time a black man walks in here to do business, remember this moment, because I will. Chris gave a stiff nod, his face drained of color. Richard turned to leave. He had come in undercover seeking the truth. Now, as he stepped toward the exit, one thing was certain. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Richard let the silence linger, allowing the weight of his words to settle. He had built this company on principles of integrity and equal opportunity. Yet here he was, confronting the very biases he had worked to eliminate. His gaze swept across the staff, measuring their reactions. Some looked away, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one had anything to say. Richard's voice didn't waver. Do you? Because from what I just experienced, it doesn't seem like it. Let me make this clear, Richard continued. This is not just about me. This is about every customer who has walked into this branch and faced unnecessary roadblocks because of someone's personal biases. He paused for a moment before addressing Reynolds directly. So, I'll ask you again, how often does this happen? Reynolds hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right answer. Mr. Lawson, I don't have those numbers offhand, but I assure you, we take these matters seriously. Richard's voice didn't waver. Do you? Because from what I just experienced, it doesn't seem like it. What I saw today was a clear, deliberate attempt to deny service based on assumption, not policy. And if that's happening to me, how many others have been turned away without a second thought? Chris exhaled shakily. Sir, I was just following what I thought was protocol. Richard turned toward him. That's exactly the problem. You thought, you assumed, but you didn't check. You didn't verify. You didn't treat me like you would any other customer who walks in here looking a little different from what you expect. Chris swallowed hard but didn't argue. Let's talk about trust, Richard continued. Customers trust us to safeguard their money, to provide reliable service, to treat them fairly, and today that trust was broken. Not just for me, but for anyone who's ever had to second guess whether they'll be treated with respect when they walk through these doors. Nancy finally spoke, her voice quiet. We didn't mean any harm. Richard nodded slowly. And yet, harm was done. Do you see the problem? Nancy lowered her eyes. Reynolds stepped forward. Mr. Lawson, I promise, we will review everything. You don't have a choice, Richard interrupted. I'm not asking. I'm telling you that starting tomorrow, this entire institution is undergoing a full-scale internal review. That includes customer service protocols, hiring practices, implicit bias training, and transparency reports on how we handle large transactions across all demographics. Reynolds nodded quickly. Absolutely, sir. We'll begin right away. Richard exhaled. And let me be very clear. If I find out that this was not an isolated incident, there will be consequences. Real ones. Chris, Nancy, and several other employees stood stiffly, absorbing his words. Richard reached for his wallet, placing his newly withdrawn money inside. He turned one last time to the staff. This isn't just about today. This is about every day moving forward. The way you treat people when you think no one is watching, that's what defines this company. And I will be watching. He glanced at Reynolds. We will speak first thing tomorrow. Have those reports ready. Reynolds nodded again, his face tight with stress. Yes, sir. Without another word, Richard walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room filled with quiet tension. The lesson had been delivered. Now it was up to them whether they learned from it. Richard sat in his office long after the bank had closed, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had spent years building this institution, shaping its policies, hiring its leaders, and crafting a vision that was meant to serve everyone equally. Yet today he had seen firsthand how easily that vision could be compromised, not by overt hostility, but by something more insidious, unchecked bias disguised as protocol. He leaned back in his chair, running through every moment at the branch. The hesitation, the excuses, the double standards. If it had happened to him, it had certainly happened to others. How many customers had walked out of his bank feeling humiliated, disrespected, or powerless? How many had chosen never to return? And how many stories, just like his own, had gone unheard? The thought was unacceptable. He had spent his career advocating for fair business practices, pushing for policies that reflected integrity and inclusivity. Yet here he was, forced to confront the cracks in his own foundation. This wasn't just about one branch or one employee. It was systemic, and that meant addressing it at every level. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting a company-wide directive. The message had to be clear. Change was not just coming, it was happening immediately, effective immediately. Mandatory bias training. Every employee, from tellers to executives, would undergo rigorous training on bias recognition and inclusive customer service. This wasn't going to be a one-time seminar, but an ongoing process, with evaluations and real accountability. Secret shopper program. A rotating team of anonymous evaluators would visit branches across the country, assessing staff interactions, monitoring consistency in policy enforcement, and reporting any disparities in treatment. Customer reporting channels. A direct, transparent system would be established to allow customers to report instances of discrimination or mistreatment. These reports would be reviewed by an independent ethics committee with the power to implement corrective actions. Zero tolerance policy. Any employee found engaging in discriminatory practices, whether intentional or due to unconscious bias, would face immediate disciplinary measures up to and including termination. No warnings, no second chances. When he finished, he reread the document twice, ensuring there was no room for ambiguity. The message had to be firm, undeniable. He sent the email to the executive leadership team with a subject line that left no doubt about his expectations. "We fix this now." The next morning, he arrived at the headquarters earlier than usual. The air in the boardroom was tense when he stepped inside. The senior executives had already received his directive, and the weight of its implications was evident. Reynolds was there, looking particularly uneasy, knowing that his branch had been the catalyst for this sudden shift. Richard took his seat at the head of the table and let the silence stretch before he spoke. "Yesterday, I went to one of our branches to make a routine withdrawal," he began. "What should have been a simple transaction turned into a lesson I should have never needed to learn." He let that statement settle before continuing. "This company was built on the principle that financial security should be accessible to everyone. That means everyone, not just those who fit a certain profile, not just those who look like they belong. If we can't uphold that promise, then we don't deserve our customers' trust." He turned to Reynolds. "Tell me, do you believe the employees at your branch intended to discriminate against me?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I don't believe they acted out of malice." Richard nodded. "Neither do I. But that's the problem. Bias doesn't always come in the form of outright hatred. It's in the policies we apply inconsistently, the extra scrutiny we place on some and not others, the assumptions we make without even realizing we're making them. And that's exactly why we can't let this slide." He scanned the room, making eye contact with each executive. "If we claim to be different from other banks, then we need to be different. No one should have to prove they deserve basic respect. No one should have to fight for the same service others receive without question." One of the senior VPs spoke up. "Richard, these changes you're proposing, they're going to require a major cultural shift. Some employees are going to resist." Richard leaned forward. "Then they can find another job." Silence. "This isn't negotiable," he said. "We're going to rebuild this institution from the ground up if we have to. Because if I can't walk into one of my own branches and trust that I'll be treated fairly, then how can we expect our customers to?" A slow murmur of agreement moved through the room. Some nodded, others took notes, but no one argued. The decision had already been made. Richard exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy process. Change never was. But after yesterday, there was no turning back. This wasn't just about policy, it was about purpose, and he was ready to fight for it. What would you have done in Richard's situation? Have you ever experienced discrimination when trying to access your own money? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss how we can hold institutions accountable for fair treatment. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light, stories that challenge the status quo and push for real change. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update.